Welcome in to the latest episode of that SEC podcast. I'm your host, Michael Bratton. I go by SEC Mike on Twitter. And we got a great show lined up. Obviously a quiet time in the SEC, so reached out to an old friend, Jesse Simonton. He's covered Tennessee, Georgia, Florida. He's been all over the SEC beat for years and years. Now he works as an SEC insider columnist over at On3 Sports, a website that I cannot recommend enough. If On3 is not on your radar already, it will be soon enough with the upcoming college football season. Cannot wait. They post content daily, all kinds of college football recruiting and insight. Ivan Maisel works over there. Chad Simmons, recruiting insider. A lot of good people over at On3 Sports. So check out all the work they're doing over there. But before we kick it over to our interview with Jesse Simonton, coming out of the spring meetings, he was down in Destin, give us some insight into what he learned down there and his impressions of some of the new coaches down there. But before we get to that, not a ton going on in the SEC, and saw this little list here from Braden Gall. I'll throw it up here on YouTube with some of the rivalries that he does not want to see gone in the SEC. Most of these, I think he's dead on here. I don't have an issue with, I really don't have an issue, so to speak, with any of these. But here's the list. The Iron Bowl, of course, Texas, Oklahoma, Texas, Texas A&M, Florida, Georgia, the Egg Bowl, Texas A&M, LSU. Found out quickly how damn important that is to Aggie fans this offseason. Georgia, Auburn. And then here's the one that I'm not 100% on the same page with Braden. Tennessee, Florida. I know a lot of Tennessee fans love that game. It's usually your first conference loss of the season, but I don't even know if that ranks in the top 3 or 4 of Florida rivalries right now. With, of course, Georgia's got to be at the top of that list. Florida State, LSU, Miami. Hell, I would even argue Kentucky is a bigger rival to the Florida Gators than Tennessee Vols at this point in time. So, I kind of made some statements. I think Alabama, Tennessee, you got to do what you can to keep that game. And a lot of Tennessee fans don't think that Alabama even considers that a rivalry. Hell, every third Saturday in October, I see that entire stadium lighting up those cigars. You're seeing coaches, you're seeing players, you're seeing alumni, all lighting up those cigars. I know East Tennessee, they got them lined up for the day they end that 14-year streak, which may be coming sooner rather than later. But a lot of Alabama people tuned in here. They really do think that Tennessee still, even though the game's not always that competitive, and far more often than not, it's not been competitive since Nick Saban's been there, but still a rivalry, in my opinion. Kind of curious to hear everyone's thoughts on that. And I say all that, and then we had the Paul Feinbaum show. I'll throw this up here. Another friend of the show, Matt Hayes, Saturday Down South, and 10XLXL there out of Jacksonville. He predicted Tennessee will upset either Alabama, October 15th in Neyland Stadium, or Georgia, November 9th on the road. Ooh, boy, that's how you make it a rivalry. You got to win these football games. So pretty interesting. Hopefully, we're going to have the Tennessee Homer back on the show real quick to get his thoughts on that. I don't really want to go on a deep dive without Cousin Shane. So we'll tackle that hopefully on the next episode of the show. I've actually got a number of other great guests lined up throughout the week, so be on the lookout for those. But now, let's kick it over to our interview. Really outstanding stuff here with Jesse Simonton of On3 Sports. All right, we're pleased to be joined once again by Jesse Simonton. Fans all across the SEC know Jesse. Give him a follow at Jesse R.E. Simonton. He's covered a number of teams across the SEC, and now he covers the entire conference for On3.com. Jesse, thank you so much for joining me once again.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me back, Michael. Good to be back with Mr. SEC Mike.
Hey, I appreciate that, Jesse. And I know you were down on location in Destin for the spring meetings. That's why I wanted to have you on. But before we get to that, can you tell us a little bit about what is your role going to be at On3, and what you'll be tackling this fall, covering the nation's best college football conference?
Yeah, I'm just kind of thankful for the opportunity. Shannon Terry and Jamie Oakes and Luke and a bunch of those guys behind the scenes at On3. We're kind of looking for someone to kind of have some opinions and some analysis and cover the SEC writ large. And so that's what I've been tabbed to do. And so I'm going to write columns and, offer commentary, and ultimately we're going to do some video and podcast stuff here down the line as well. So obviously it's the most exciting sport to me in college. That is college football, and covering, the best conference. Couldn't ask for anything more. So should be a hell of a 2022 season. There's just storylines galore. I've jumped into a bunch of stuff, written a bunch of different pieces, columns, and what have you already the first kind of 2 months on the gig. And obviously this past week at the spring meetings were busy, to say the least.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of the spring meetings, of course, the 8 or the 9 game SEC schedule, that was a hot topic. Intra-conference transfers, I know that is something that you tackled. But aside from those two key issues, anything else that you kind of learned or took away from, just from all the interactions you had down there at the spring meetings?
Yeah, I mean, those in terms of like the actual storylines, I guess, were probably the most interesting. Obviously, also the NIL, can't overlook that just because of, the different branches that it had with the Jimbo Nick feud, but also just kind of, where this whole thing is going. But I think just being on the ground back in Destin for the first time in several years, obviously they hadn't held in-person spring meetings since COVID. It was just good to kind of, frankly, be and get some FaceTime with so many coaches, both, kind of on and off the record and, over to the side, and even just kind of mingling. And I think those connections and that kind of interaction is extremely valuable. And so, there was lots of guys there who, they'd been in the league for a year, the Shane Beamers, and the Clark Lees of the world, Ryan Harsin, but this was their kind of first time in that environment. And then seeing the new guys and kind of, getting to meet Billy Napier and kind of size him up, and getting to meet some unique personalities that are obviously going to be big names, big faces in this league for years to come.
Now, I already know the answer to this question because I follow you at Jesse R.E. Simonton, but the great SEC schedule debate, 8 or 9 games. Tell the audience why you're a big proponent of the 9-game schedule, as you should rightfully be, Jesse.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you and I land on the same side of the coin on this one. I've been using the word poison pill. I think the fact that Greg Sankey has basically come down to the fact that it's a 1-7 or the 8-game model versus the 3-6 and 9-game model. To me, that just means there's really only one model. Again, being on the ground there in Destin, there was a lot of momentum, I think, by that Tuesday evening, that 3-6, that three permanent rivals, 6 rotating games, that was generating a lot of momentum. And then you had the Kentuckys and the Arkansas kind of lock arms, and some other schools, whether it's Ole Miss, South Carolina, so on, kind of have some trepidation about maybe diving into a 9-game conference slate. When you break it down, again, we both agree, the 1-7 model makes no sense. You don't invite Texas into the league and not have them play Texas A&M every year. I know they haven't played for a decade, but there's a reason why they want to reignite that rivalry. You don't eliminate the South's oldest rivalry in Georgia-Auburn. You don't get rid of Tennessee-Alabama. It doesn't really matter to me how many times the Tide have beaten the Vols in the last 15 years. That's still a game that both fan bases really enjoy. And yeah, there's a reason why Alabama keeps lighting up these cigars after they beat Tennessee, because that game does mean something to the Crimson Tide. And so preserving as many of those great games as possible, and then giving yourself more good games on the schedule where, okay, Oklahoma is now in the conference. You can allow them to continue their rivalry with Texas. You can reignite the rivalries with either Missouri, or Arkansas, and then give them a team X, whether it's Florida or somebody else, and then you have Oklahoma playing Georgia every couple of years. I just think the 9-game schedule makes too much sense. The 1-7-1, honestly, I've called it a poison pill because I think ultimately they don't want to go down that road. I get why the Kentuckys and the Mississippi States have concerns about playing that many conference games, plus being forced to play a Power 5 game. I think ultimately more negotiating happens. They get rid of that rule where you have to play another Power 5 team. So if Florida State and Florida still want to play, awesome. Same for Georgia, Georgia Tech, Clemson, South Carolina. But Arkansas doesn't have to schedule another team. Mississippi State doesn't have to schedule another team. And so you can still get your, extra couple wins that help preserve bowl eligibility, but then we can, move forward as a conference with a 9-game schedule.
Yeah, and it's been reported that, maybe they don't want to vote just yet because they don't know the future of the playoff and if that's going to expand and all that. And I think there's one other issue, maybe the TV contracts, but looking beyond those 2 points, because I do think the playoff thing is at least marginally a reason why they decided not to vote. Not to interject and you there. I only say that because Nick Saban did not say that explicitly, but we both know that Nick is someone that has very much been a proponent for a 9-game schedule for more than a decade now. But he did make it known that he wants to play 9, but he does want it to be equitable with like the rest of college football. And that is, in so many words, saying, okay, if we don't really know where the playoffs going, I want to make sure if we play 9, that the Big 12 is still going to play 9, that the Big 10 intends to play 9. We'll see how the ACC contract with their deal ultimately happens. But I think Nick is good with the 9 so long as everybody else keeps doing that as well. So sorry to interrupt you there. Yeah, no worries. So, I mean, that kind of goes with what I was going to ask you, though. But, moving aside from the playoff, moving aside from, any hiccups potentially in the new contract, because that was negotiated before the 9-game, obviously, and I believe it was negotiated before Texas and Oklahoma came into the league. Any concern that moving from an 8 to a 9 game is going to lead to a lot more injuries, which is just going to, Alabama and Georgia, they've been dominant for a reason. They got the best players, and if there's more injuries across the SEC, I think it's safe to say the teams with the best depth are going to be able to handle that, obviously, a lot better than some of the others. And, maybe kind of the same type of question, but if you go to 9, you potentially risk losing some late season ranked matchups because there may be a lot of 5-4 SEC teams, 4-5 SEC type teams, and then at the tail end of the season when you need a win over a top 20 Auburn or a top 15 Arkansas to boost your playoff profile, that may be tougher to come by in a 9-game conference schedule. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, the latter one is a good point. That's honestly something that I haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about. I do think that there's going to be that middle, but there kind of already is that, I mean, the SEC already kind of gets a little bit of the benefit in some of the rankings, and so, yes, some of those teams eventually fall out, but you'll also see them, Tennessee was 7-6 last year, and they were still, and I think they had a hell of a season, but they still were kind of flirting with that top 25 status, towards the end of the year, even though they had, several losses on their resume. As for the injury thing, I do think that if the 9-game schedule is adopted, you're going to see some rule changes that maybe shorten the games a little bit. Kirby Smart's been kind of at the forefront. He was on, one of those committees. He's proposed or at least teased several ideas. And I'm not saying this is something that's definitely going to come to fruition, but like one way that you could protect the players and maybe while you're technically adding an extra conference game, maybe shorten, some of that exposure is maybe you have a running clock even after incompletions until the 2-minute warning. Just simple things like that where that would alleviate some of those depth concerns for your Vanderbilts and some of those teams.
Now, another thing that you really, I got to hand it to you, Jesse. I believe you asked every damn coach down there about the intra-conference transfer rule. So for those that don't know, if you play in the SEC already, you got to be in the transfer portal by February 1 if you want to remain you're eligible to play in the following season and transfer. That deadline is May 1 for the rest of the NCAA, so that was an issue there at Destin. What's your sense of the SEC, and do you think they end up moving that, or do you think they're going to keep it at the February 1 date?
Well, the fact they didn't vote on it, I think kind of confirms where I believe the wind, was kind of blowing when I left Destin, which is Alabama and Nick Saban may have sponsored that proposal to move it back to a universal, May 1 date. But the rest of the conference seems pretty darn content on keeping it where it is. Nick and Kirby are in agreement on most things, but Georgia is one of the proponents of they like that February 1 date, and then just kind of rattle off the rest of the list. I mean, Ole Miss, Lane Kiffin told me, why he thought it was a good idea. He even doubled down that and gave me the information that, and some other coaches, who may or may not be named, that they think that, basically the exposure of these spring games, guys will just be puddle jumping afterwards if they gave that rule up. And so they would just cancel their spring game if they didn't have the February 1 date anymore. I don't think that's going to happen. That's a little hyperbolic, but it just shows you where the mindset is for some of these coaches. Shane Beamer was in agreement. Let's keep it. Jimbo told me, let's keep it. Florida, which sponsored the February 1 rule in the first place, Billy Napier wants to keep it. And so, I think you can make arguments for both sides, but I understand why these coaches want to protect that one transfer window, because it does allow guys to go ahead, all right, make the decision before the spring, and then so if you want to leave Georgia and go to South Carolina like Lavasa Carriel did, or all these guys that left Arkansas and went to LSU and vice versa, or Jermaine Burton to Alabama, do that before the February 1 deadline. If you want to participate with us in spring practice, go through it just fine. But then if you want to transfer, you're welcome to leave, but you just can't leave within the conference, after that May 1 date. And the irony is that while the SEC had this proposal on the books to move the deadline forward to the rest of the NCAA, you have all these other conferences the previous weeks, the ACC, the Big 12, Pac-12 leaders, they're all flirting with the idea of adopting the SEC policy, whereas they don't want their guys transferring from Oklahoma State to Baylor, or California to USC, so on and so forth. So many of these conferences are discussing the idea of adopting that same February 1 deadline. So I think the more firm these transfer portal windows are, the more it makes sense for these college coaches. Again, I understand the arguments on both sides, but for these college coaches, these firm kind of hard deadlines make more sense.
Mm-hmm. Now, the only other thing there in Destin was a huge talking point going into it. Nick Saban, Jimbo Fisher. I don't know about you, Jesse, but I was basically tired of talking about it leading up to it, and there was no fireworks as expected, at least from me. But let me ask it to you this way. Now, I certainly don't think Jimbo Fisher's on any kind of hot seat, but I think he did himself a big favor with his fan base, getting on Nick Saban, defending his program, because coming off a really disappointing season, he's probably more popular than he's ever been. Do you agree with that, yes or no? And what do you make of the Aggies heading into this season?
I wholeheartedly agree with you that he has engendered lots of goodwill with the way he's kind of been the coach that's been willing to kind of swing back at Nick. Now, we can laugh at the fact that, he called Saban a narcissist, and then he said that in the very press conference that he held when he could have just released a statement or, basically denied said accusations from Nick. So the fact that he held his own grandstanding performance and called another man a narcissist is hilarious. And there's been plenty of laughs and good jokes to take out of this entire couple weeks of back and forth. But I think you're right. He has probably, escaped, maybe not criticism, but escaped a little bit of Well, I mean, Jimbo, you haven't won the 10 games yet because he did beat Alabama last year, and then he, followed that up with this historic recruiting class, which he has so vehemently defended from the NIL accusations. I think that A&M set up for a fascinating season because these five-star recruits, the majority of them are not going to be ready to compete, to help on day one. Some will, but I think really it's going to be some guys they signed a year ago, Stewart, some of these other defensive linemen that I think are going to be in position to kind of take a leap forward. They're sophomore surges. So it's going to be about the quarterback. Who do they choose there? Do they go with Max Johnson? Do they go back? Jimbo's been a guy who's really seen something in Haynes King. So do they lean that way? What about the freshman in Wegman? So I still think they're a year away, which makes it even more interesting that, Jimbo has been so ardent about, pushing A&M forward because they're probably going to be a tad overranked as maybe the fifth or sixth team in the country because I'm not sure they're quite that good because I think they do have some youth on both sides of the ball. So could be a year away. And if they do stumble a couple more times, if they lose to a Mississippi State again, or they don't beat Bama, which few expect on October 8th, and then have another, maybe Auburn catches them or something like that, suddenly Jimbo's definitely not going to be on the hot seat, not with that contract. But I think that he may feel the heat because of what the expectations will be coming off, an offseason where he's puffed his chest so loudly, and the expectation that, the Aggies, Georgia just got it. That means Texas A&M and their 70-some-odd year national championship drought. They're the next team up.
Mm-hmm. All right, Jesse, I really appreciate all your time. One last question for you. Everybody and their mother is going to be picking Alabama to win the West. They're going to be picking Georgia to win the East, and I understand those predictions. But if you had to pick one dark horse from each division, to put together a miracle-type season, maybe a player or two emerges, and, it could be the schedule, could be the talent on the roster, whatever, but one team from each division that poses the biggest threat to Alabama and Georgia this fall.
Well, I'm on record as saying I think Tennessee's going to finish second, but I don't think – I think their floor and ceiling are fairly defined. So if you're positing it as a miracle season, then I would say based on the schedule, if Kentucky has a miracle season, maybe they're the team that could push Georgia in the East. I do think the Bulldogs are just so much better than any team in the SEC East. That I would be very surprised if that happens. But with Will Levis, if he makes a jump, stops turning the ball over, if an offensive line that's replacing a bunch of bodies kind of coalesces, I love, some of those defensive line recruits that are now kind of going into their junior season. They should be ready to make a leap. So the pieces are there in Lexington. Stoops is obviously one of the better coaches, not only in the conference, but the country, that if they did have this dreamlike year, perhaps they could be the one. I think the West is trickier, honestly. I mean, I know that you love Sam Pittman. I'm really high on Arkansas too. But I'm going to go massive wild card. Again, if we're talking dream season, few people are talking about this team. To me, it's not A&M because I don't think that's a dream season. At least, they're expected to be number 2. What about LSU? I don't know where you stand on LSU, but I think that they probably have as wide a variance of any team in the entire SEC this year. I could see them finishing number 2 and being a team that's like, that's who it's going to be in 2023, the next team up, because there is some really talented youth on that roster. I think the defensive line is going to be one of the best in the country, but there is so many question marks. Offensive line, can they find a running game? What about quarterback? That they could finish as high as second in the West or they could finish last. So if I'm talking dream season, highest ceiling versus lowest floor, let me see what Brian Kelly's Tigers do. He's won everywhere he's been. I don't expect this to happen. This is obviously a wild scenario, but if you're taking any team in terms of highest ceiling, give me LSU.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. No idea what to expect from them, Florida, or Ole Miss, but that's why this fall is going to be so much fun. Really outstanding stuff from you, Jesse. Jesse R.E. Simonton. Check out all his work, on3.com. Thank you. I really appreciate this, Jesse.
Absolutely. Appreciate you having me on, Michael. Good to catch up.
All right, so just want to say thanks to Jesse once again for joining the show. Give him a follow at Jesse R.E. Simonton. You can find that in the show notes of this podcast. Really appreciate the insight from Jesse down there in Destin, and hopefully we'll get some more insight from insiders that were on location for the SEC spring meetings. But hey, we're trying to keep pushing out the content. Next couple of weeks, I know we just had the spring meetings. We got SEC Media Days coming up. There's going to be some dark times on the college football calendar with just not a lot to talk about. So I'm going to do my best to line up outstanding interviews like we're doing here, kind of come up with some show ideas. But we're going to keep trying to make this a daily occurrence as long as we can. But we may miss a day here or there, so just wanted to make note of that. But as always, if you made it this far, if you wouldn't mind giving us that 5-star written review on the Apple Podcast app, and now you can give us a review on Spotify if you're not an Apple user. We appreciate each and every one of those, and it really does help the show grow, really trying to push all those rankings. Don't forget YouTube. If you haven't checked out by now, I don't know what the hell you're doing with your life. Give us a follow and like our content on YouTube. And you do any of those, we'll send you a beer koozie free of charge. Just reach out to us at thatsecpodcast@gmail.com. And we're happy to send you a beer koozie representing your SEC team. We got all 14 koozies ready to go to be mailed out to you. But that's going to do it for this episode of the show. We'll catch you on the next one.